So it's a privilege to be here and be able to speak this morning. Let me start by asking you a question. What is the thing that matters most to you in life? What's the thing that you would say is the most important thing in your life? If you had to lose everything in life, what's the one thing that you wouldn't want to be without? A recent survey of 18 to 34-year-olds were asked this question: what's the most important thing in your life? What matters to you most? You know, the number one thing they said that was the most important thing to them in their life was internet connection. That's it. That's what they thought was the most important thing, the 2,000 18 to 35-year-olds that were surveyed. In slot number 2 was television. Interestingly, it wasn't until like number 7 that someone said cup of tea is the most important thing for them, which, you know, I get. More surprisingly to me, though, is that it wasn't until position number 13 that someone said chocolate. Chocolate is the most important thing to them. And to me, that's a bit of a surprise, because I would have thought that chocolate would be further up the list, at least next to a cup of tea, because the two of them go so well together. Dominique, who kind of put this table together, I didn't know, but I've just discovered she's put a Cadbury's cream egg in there for me, because she knows how much I love chocolate. There are lots of things that are important to life, but there's something that I want to suggest that is more important than anything else in life. Something that if you didn't experience it or you lost it would affect every aspect of your life, from your physical health to your mental health, from your emotional well-being to your spiritual well-being. I think the thing that matters most in life is love. Is love. You could train your body to get out of bed in the morning without the need of a cup of tea. You really could. You could survive a whole year without the need of going online. I know you could, guys, particularly you could. It's true. You could live a life without chocolate. You understand I'm saying you could. I couldn't. But if you tried to live a life without love, it could kill you. The absence of love is loneliness, and loneliness is incredibly bad for your health. A recent survey into loneliness and isolation found that the people who are lonely or isolated are more at risk for heart disease, stroke, having immune system issues, even having a harder time recovering from cancer. And a study into the physiological effects of loneliness concluded that actually it was as bad for your health as smoking more than 15 cigarettes a day. And Jo Cox, a Labour MP who was tragically killed in 2016, she once said, young or old, loneliness does not discriminate. I think you could add into that, other things, because it's not actually just about age. You could say a wealthy or poor, male or female, lots of social media likes or no social media likes, in work or out of work. Loneliness does not discriminate. And loneliness has been a hot topic in our nation for a number of years, actually. In 2014, there was a report done that concluded that the UK was the loneliest place to live in Europe. Now, this is before Brexit, Well done us. We might have lost the World Cup, but we're European champions of your loneliness. There's been lots of research that's been done into the extent of loneliness. One recent survey found that 3 out of 4 GPs say that they see between 1 and 5 people every single day, not because of necessarily medical grounds, but because they're just lonely. They just come into the doctor's surgery because they're lonely. 9 million people in our nation say that they're not just lonely some of the time, they're lonely all of the time. 200,000 older people in our nation will go a whole month without having a conversation with a friend or a relative. A bit of research done by Age UK found that For 3.6 million people over the age of 65, their main form of companionship is the television. 85% of young adults aged between 18 and 34 who've got a disability say they feel lonely. And last year, a kind of report into the causes and the extents of loneliness was commissioned. It was called the Joe Cox Commission. It's an interesting read. It was 13 organizations that came together to highlight the issues and the causes of loneliness. And the conclusions of that led the Prime Minister, Theresa May, to appoint the first Minister for Loneliness, Tracy Crouch. She was appointed earlier on in January this year. And at a press conference, the Prime Minister, she said this: "For far too many people, loneliness is the sad reality of modern life." And she went on to say, to confront the challenge our society has, she wanted to take action and address loneliness, people who have no one to talk to and no one to share their thoughts with. You know, some of the most biggest thinkers in our nation are trying to come up with a plan to solve loneliness. Cornwall Council, just a few months ago, they hosted an online event where they asked everyone to kind of tune in and give them their ideas of like how you can solve the problem of loneliness. You know, surely someone out of 7 billion people living on this planet can come up with a system whereby no one is lonely anymore. And someone did. Jesus once said, "A new commandment I give you, to love one another." That's it. It's as simple as that. To love one another. That's how you solve the problem of loneliness. That's Jesus' command to us, because he recognized that the absence of love is loneliness, and loneliness will kill you. John Ortberg, Christian writer and pastor, he once said, "When I think about love, I think about a table." And he went on to say that whenever he thought about moments in his life where there were big decisions to make, or moments to celebrate, or moments to grieve, there would always be a table that people would gather around. And to sit at the table was to know that you were loved, to know that you belonged. And I think he's right. I know in my life, when I think about love, I think about a table. I can still remember the table we had growing up as children, actually. My dad would sit here, my mum would sit at the end, my brother would sit next to me, my sister would sit over on this side. The only exception to that would be when my granddad came to stay every other weekend, and he would sit here. And my brother and I, Nigel, we would fight over who didn't have to sit opposite him, because he was old and he was a messy eater. He had false teeth. Food came out of his mouth as fast as it went in. Our family table was a place where we would gather at 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock on the dot, very precise, every day, to share our experiences of the day, good or bad. You know, often there was laughter at the table. Sometimes there was too much laughter at the table. My brother used to make it his mission to make me laugh when I was eating so that food would come out of my nose. It was disgusting. At which point my dad told my brother, "You have to go and eat your meal in the kitchen table. You can't eat it at the dining room table anymore." And so off he went. The problem is, I could see the kitchen table from the dining room table. And he would continue to make it his mission to kind of make me laugh, to the point where I was told, "You got to go and sit at the kitchen table too." You know, sometimes things got so bad that all 3 of us children were eating at the kitchen table while mum and dad were trying to finish their meal at the dining room table. And at the end of the meal, dad would come out and with a sigh, he would just say these words to us: "Well, that's another mealtime you've ruined." It was 25. 25. I wasn't 25, but it was 25 years ago. But you can be sure that if we ever gather now as a family, as a wider family, around a table for Christmas or a moment to celebrate. And if there ever gets a little bit too much laughter, you can guarantee one of us will say, well, that's another mealtime you've ruined. When I think about love, I think about a table. As I got older, there were other tables. I started dating a girl called Rachel, and I was invited to come and sit at her family table. I learned quite early on that her family table was quite different from our family table. There was different rules. You know, they did things in a slightly different way. In our family table, when we sat round it, there was, like for a sandwich tea, there was always a plate of pre-buttered bread. And there was a couple of lumps of cheese, a couple of spreads, some ham, and then there was a beautifully arranged plate of homemade cakes. My brother would always look at it and then look at Mum and say, have you got any cakes with wrappers on? Which is rude. Rachel's family table, it was different. When they had a sandwich tea, everything came out of the fridge and was dumped into the middle of the table. Everything came out of the cupboards and is dumped into the middle of the table for you just to kind of pick through leftovers from yesterday, things that may be out of date even. It's just all on the middle of the table. It's like the fridge and the kitchen just vomited on the table. I hope my in-laws are not listening. After you've eaten, someone would make a cup of tea, and then sometimes a second cup of tea, sometimes there would be a third cup of tea. You would sit around the table sometimes until it was time to eat again. There seemed to be no time frame for sitting at the table at all. They had different personalities. They had different styles of talking to one another. They had different styles of arguing with one another. I had to adapt, but when I think about love, I think about that table now. When Rachel and I got married, we had our own table. This is a picture, if we can get it up on the screen, of Rachel and I. I think I found it this week. This is our first meal at our table. I know what you're thinking, man, he has not changed one bit. And to sit at the table, it was nice and quiet. It was a place to relax. It was a place for us to kind of get to know each other. It doesn't look like it in that picture, but often the table was quite tidy. And then we had to make space at our table because we had a child, and this happened. This person came along. All of a sudden, the table was not a place to sit and linger and drink lots of cup of tea. You just try to get through the table experience. Sometimes there was more food on the floor than there was on the table. I realize that's probably because I used to feed my kids using chopsticks. It's part of my culture. Ask me about that afterwards. But even though it was messy and even though it was chaotic, I came to love that table. It's where we kind of bonded as a family. And so when I think about love, I think about that table. We have 3 children now, and I've got a picture of our table as it is at the moment. As William always sits in the corner of the table against the wall, and we've got a bench that goes down one side. I always sit next to him. Grace sits over on this side. Rachel, my wife, sits here, and Amy sits on the end. We always sit in the same place. William, he's a clever kid. He sits in the corner because if he needs like a glass of water or there's something missing from the table, he can't get out. So people have to serve him. He's clever. The chair at the end in our family is called the getting chair. If you sit on that chair, you have to get things that other people have forgotten. Only Amy seems to be happy to sit on the getting chair. When I think about love, I think about a table. There's quite a lot about tables in the Bible. In the Old Testament, God gives the Israelites, who were God's chosen people, instructions to make something called a tabernacle. It was basically a place where God said, I'm going to come and dwell with you, my people. And he gave very clear instructions of how this tabernacle should be made. We've got a picture of it that can come up on the screen. It had a kind of like a fence around it. In the middle was like this tent. It was a kind of movable place. And God doesn't give many instructions about what should be in his tabernacle, in his house. It would appear God's a minimalist, but he does give instructions for there to be a table in his house. And he gives very clear instructions about this table. He says that it is to be overlaid with gold, that the plates and the dishes are to be made out of pure gold. It's a very fancy pants table. And on the table, he says there should be bread. It's called the bread of the presence. And the Bible tells us that the Israelites are divided up into 12 different tribes. And we're told that there are 12 loaves of bread that are to be around the table all the time. One for each tribe. Not 8, not 9, not just enough for a few of the tribes, but everyone gets a seat at the table. No one is excluded. You don't have to turn up early to ensure that you get a seat at the table. No, you've got a seat at the table all the time. Everyone's included. Fresh bread is a very distinct smell, actually. They say that smells are really closely linked to our memory, more so than any other of our senses. Smells have the ability to transport you back to places in your life. Whenever I think smell like cheese straws, I'm instantly transported back to my grandma's house. Steve's nodding. He's my cousin, by the way. She made the best cheese straws this side of Uckfield. And bread has a distinct smell as well. It's almost like God wanted that smell of bread to be going around his house all the time. So wherever you are, whoever you are, whatever you've done, however far away you are from his house, when you smell the bread, you remember the table. And when you remember the table, you remember you've got a seat at the table, you've got a place at the table. You've got a place where you're loved, a place where you belong. There's another table story in the Bible. We read about this great king called King David. When he was younger, he was friends with someone called Jonathan. Jonathan was the son of the previous king, King Saul. And when they were younger, David and Jonathan used to hang out together a lot. They used to do lots of things together. They went on adventures together. Jonathan sat at David's table sometimes. And then years and years later, a long time after Jonathan has died and King Saul has died and David is now king, David is sitting at his table and he gets one of his servants in and he says to him, "Is there anyone left in the household of Saul that I can show kindness to for the sake of Jonathan?" You know, he remembered Jonathan. He loved Jonathan. He wanted to continue to do something that's going to bless his household. And so the servant goes off. And he comes back and he says to David, "There is someone still alive. His name is Mephibosheth. And he's a cripple. He's lame in both feet." And so David sends for him and asks him to come and sit at his table. And Mephibosheth says to King David, he's confused, he bows down, and he says, "Why would you notice a dead dog like me?" He recognizes he's a nobody. He hasn't got anything to offer, nothing to bring to the table. He's surprised at the invite because he knows the deal when it comes to being invited to people's tables. You normally get an invite to the table if you are like the other person. If you've got something in common with the other person, you're invited to the table maybe because, you share the same sort of love of cycling or sport. Maybe you work in the same sector. Maybe you're from the same culture. You're invited to the table because you're like the person. And he recognizes, I'm not like you at all. Or you get invited to the table because the person recognizes that you could be useful to me. I might need you. I'm going to invite you. Sometimes we talk like this and we say, what do you think that person has got to bring to the table? As if to invite them would to add value to your table somehow. And Mephibosheth realized he's got nothing to add to the table. But 4 times we're told that Mephibosheth ate at the king's table as if he was the child of the king. This nobody, this guy that had nothing to bring. And when I think about love, I think about a table and how on God's table, it's not built around power or prestige, or it's not built on wealth or status. It's built on love, on servanthood, on grace, on community. People get invited to the table not because of what they can bring or what they can do or because they're like you or because they can fulfill a need. They just get invited to God's table because God loves them. They're known by God. God wants to hang out with them. And tables that are built on those principles are the best tables to be part of. And I've had the privilege of being a part of a few in my time. Tables where you're invited just because of who you are. Because they want to sit with you. They want to love you and accept you, not with any preconceived ideas about what you might bring to the table. They're some of the best tables to be part of. One of Jesus' most famous stories is about a table. You can read about it in Luke chapter 15. There's a father that's sitting with his 2 sons. And one day, one of his younger son turns to his dad and he says to him, I want you to give me my share of the inheritance, which is an outrageous request. You don't get your inheritance until your dad's dead. So it's basically saying, I wish you were dead, Dad. And the father decides he's going to give his younger son his inheritance, and he gives it to him, and then off he goes. He leaves the family table, the younger son, and the story continues, and it says that he goes into a distant land and he squanders all of his money on wild living. And all the father can do is just sit at the table and wait. Wait to see if the son will come home. Just kind of stare at the empty chair, wondering if he's going to come home, when he's going to come home. Maybe you know what that feels like. And then one day the son does come home. And he comes in and he recognizes the best place for him is in his father's house. And he comes full of shame and regret, wondering how he's going to be accepted. And the father just sees him coming. He leaps off the table. He goes and grabs him. He hugs him. He kisses him. And he brings him back. He says, come and sit back down at the table. The chair has been empty, waiting for your return. And then we read that he throws a banquet. There's lots of lavish food all over the table. There's a calf that is killed. They have like a hog roast barbecue. And as this younger son then comes and sits back at the table, now the older son, who has been sitting at the table all this time, serving the family all this time, and he says, well, if he's going to sit at the table, I'm not going to sit at the table. And he gets up and he goes off and he walks off, kicks his chair off, goes outside. You know, it's a strange thing. Sometimes we don't want to sit at the table with other people. Sometimes we go out for a meal with, as a family, with some friends. And before we get there, the kids, like lots of kids, they all sit around the table and they just start an argument starts. I don't want to sit next to him. I don't want to sit next to her. I don't want to sit next to Daddy. Offended? I don't want to sit next to Mummy. It feels sometimes like a battle to just get everyone to be happy to sit at the table. It's a weird thing about human beings. Sometimes we don't want to sit at the table with other people. Our world is being wrecked actually by this kind of, I don't want to sit at the table with him mentality. And that mentality can sometimes creep into our churches as well. You know, the father in the story, he goes outside, he leaves the table, and he follows his eldest son out, and he pleads with him to come and sit back down at the table. Because the father grieves over every empty chair. Let me ask you, how are you doing with sitting at the table with people? Even in this room, are there people in this room that, if you're honest, you haven't sat at the table with them for a while? You got upset with them. You've got to know that grieves God's heart. And he longs for you to sort it out and come and sit back down at the table with them again. There's no place for that in his house. Strangely, what often stops people sitting at the table is not because maybe they've had an argument with someone or they got upset. It's not even because they are fearful of kind of being rejected at the table or worrying that they haven't got anything to bring to the table. Sometimes what stops people coming to the table is just time. We're all too busy, and days go past and months go past, and before you know it, you've got lonely. Everyone's trying to work out, how do you fix the problem of loneliness, this epidemic in our nation? I think part of the answer is that we've just got too busy. And we've forgotten the importance of sitting at the table, the importance of gathering with friends, of being part of community. Let me ask you, have you got enough space in your diary for sitting at the table? And you might say, well, I'm too busy. There's just so much going on. I'm just in this season of busyness that it will end one day. Don't bet on it. I want to encourage you in this season, in this term, don't squeeze out the table. Make sure you maybe some of you, I know myself included, but just got to re-look at our diaries again and just kind of maybe move some things out to create some space for sitting at the table with one another. Because to sit at the table is to know that you're loved, is to be part of community, is to be part of friendship. To not sit at the table is loneliness, and if you don't make space for it, it could kill you. In our communities, people are spending more and more time sitting behind a desk and less time sitting behind a table. People think that it's the desk where they'll find their significance. It's the desk where they'll find their purpose in life. It's the desk that is going to bring them fulfillment. It's the desk that's going to give them their sense of identity. John Ortberg, he said this. He said that some people are sacrificing their lives on the altar, which is the desk. They're sacrificing their marriages and their families. And he goes on to say that you and I did not start our life out behind a desk. We started it out behind a table. And it's the table that will give you your sense of identity. It's gathering with friends, sitting at God's table, that will help you to know your purpose in life. It's sitting at God's table which will help you know who you are, help you know that you're significant, not a desk. And the interesting thing about Jesus is that he carved out lots of time to sit at tables. And he was a busy guy. You only got to read through the Gospels and you find that Jesus is very busy, but he always found time to sit down with anyone and everyone who would sit with him. There's this story that you find in Luke's Gospel, chapter 5, where Jesus calls a tax collector called Levi to come and follow him, to come and be one of his disciples. And we're told that Levi throws a big banquet and invites all of his friends to be part of the banquet. And at the banquet are tax collectors who were like, no one would spend any time with tax collectors. You wouldn't sit down with tax collectors. They weren't very liked people. And it also says they're also socially and morally corrupt people at this banquet. And Jesus is there sitting with all these people. And we read that the religious leaders at the time, they see Jesus sitting at the table and they look at him and they say, why do you sit with tax collectors and sinners? You see, they don't understand. They think that the way that you honor God, the way that you remain holy, is to exclude people from the table. The way that you honor God is how few people you are happy to sit with. That was their view. But Jesus comes along and he says it's not about, if you're going to show God how much you love him, it's not about how many people you exclude from the table, it's about how many you include. The measuring tool to which how much you are honoring God and loving God is about how many people you're prepared to sit at the table with. And the religious leaders didn't like it at all, and they ended up killing him for it. And just before Jesus is arrested and he's taken away to be executed, he gets his disciples, his 12 disciples, and he invites them in a room. And what you don't read is that he says, come on, I want you to come and sit behind a desk. I'm going to be leaving soon, and we need to come up with a strategy. I've got some work for you to do. So come and sit behind a desk, and let's come up for a plan for how to establish my kingdom on earth. We don't read he invites them to kind of sit behind a desk. What you read is he invites them to come and sit down with him at a table. And we're told that the table was bread of the presence. It was the Passover Jewish festival time. And Jesus picks up the bread and he breaks it. And he says to them, this is my body. It's going to be broken for you. And then there's some wine on the table, and he picks it up and he says, this wine is the new covenant. It's a symbol of my blood that is spilt for you for the forgiveness of sins. Whenever you sit down together and you eat the bread and you drink the wine, remember me. And so when I think about love, I think about that table as well. You know, we live in a nation where people are more lonely than ever before. More people are isolated than ever before. Maybe you're sitting here and you're feeling lonely. In a room this size, there'd be lots of people that would say, I feel lonely. I feel isolated. And Jesus says, a new commandment I give to you. Love one another. And our heart's desire here at King's is that you'll find a place here which you feel at home. A place you feel like you belong, a place where you feel like you find tables to sit around with people. It could be, it doesn't have to be for like a 3-course meal. It doesn't have to be a table, that's all fancy pants. It could be a table in a coffee house. It could be a table in a pub. It could be a table with a Monopoly board on the middle of it. It could be a messy table. It could be a tidy table. The activity and the state of the table is not important. It's the sitting at the table that we so desperately want to see happen here at King's, in God's house. Because to sit at the table, to have a place where you feel needed and known, a place where you feel accepted, will move you from loneliness to being loved. The church is God's house, the place where he says he's going to come and dwell by his Spirit. You need to know there's a place for you here. There's a seat for you in his house at the King's table. It's not dependent on what you have to offer. It's not dependent on what you have to bring. It's not dependent on what you've done or what you haven't done. If you walk away, the chair won't just be taken away and discarded. It will remain empty until you come back to it and sit at it again. Maybe you've walked away from the table, walked away from the chair. You've got to know if you have ever done that, it grieves God. It grieves us, actually, as a family. I remember when we went to multiple meetings, and we started having 2 meetings here. There was a lot more empty chairs in the room just because there was 2 meetings. And I felt God really speak to me clearly when I was looking out at all the empty chairs, thinking, it looks a little bit sparse. And God said to me, I know the names of every single person who are going to sit on those chairs. Every single one of those chairs is reserved for someone. You've got to know there's a chair here for you. Maybe you're listening to this online. Maybe you're watching this on YouTube. Do you know what? It's great that we have this technology that you can do that. I'm so glad that you get to listen to this in your home or in your car or walking or whatever. And I know it's just great that you're able to kind of catch it if you've kind of had a week away with family or maybe you're ill. It's great. But I want to say to you, if you're watching this online, or if you're listening to this online, as good as that is, you've got to know there's a seat for you in this room. There's a chair reserved for you. And being part of it will move you from being lonely to being loved. And we'd love you to come and join us. When I think about love, I think about a table. And my prayer is that you find multiple tables here that you can sit at, where you will find this term, places where you are loved and places where you can demonstrate the love of God.